Okay, so this is part two. Hi, look, a camera. That's so nice. I'm always so happy for any of you that can be on camera. It makes it more pleasant. And Valor, you're almost always on camera. And Pearl and Helen, I really I'm so happy to have faces to talk to. This is part two of what I expect will be three parts on Aishet Chayil, on a woman of valor. And just as a very quick summary. So last week we went through the verses and we talked about them on the level of pshat, on the level of the simple meaning of the text. And the feedback I got on that was good. And I think that it'll be, I hope it'll be enjoyable for you to go a little deeper this week, because this week we're going to the level of drash. What is drash? Remember, I said that drash sounds like midrash. It is sort of the second level of commentary. And what did I say about it? I'm sorry. It's sort of remez and drash together. Remez is where there's remez literally means a hint, and it's a hint of what's hidden in the text, and also it is also an interpretation of the text. So I think you'll see what I mean. Natalie, welcome. We've already started. We're just reviewing. Um, we're going to go through all of the verses again, but now we're going to talk about how these verses relate to a different woman. Most of them are in Tanakh. I realized as I was reviewing that one of them you're probably going to be very not familiar with because her story is told in the Talmud, but I'll give you a little bit of background. Okay. So some of you routinely take notes, and this time you might, if you're not already prepared to do so, you might actually want to, only because I'm going to mention a couple of verses throughout our discussion where you can look at the stories more deeply, biblical verses, but I am not going to quote them for you. Okay. So we are in the book of Proverbs, in the book of Mishlei, chapter 31, verse 10. And the verse says in English, an accomplished woman, Eshet Chayil, an accomplished woman who can find far beyond pearls is her value. Okay. Now, there's one opinion that this is a reference to our foremother, Sarah. Abraham and Sarah operated in life as a team, working together to spread a belief in one God, which was very revolutionary for the time. Um, and so Sarah was a full partner with him. This you already know. But what is the connection to this verse? There's two for her. One is that how do we get pearls? We have to retrieve them from inside the oyster. Okay. And so each of her days, the rabbis say that Sarah retrieved beauty and purity from the depth of the immorality among which she lived. And also, just as God chose to form pearls in the depth of the sea, which is a very interesting thing just to contemplate, that that something that we would consider so precious is formed in the way that it is. Our foremother Sarah also took the irritations of daily life and transformed them into gems. Okay. So that is an example of how this verse, and particularly the word peninim, the word for pearls, the word that means internality, or inside of something. Um, like when we go to a restaurant, let's say, and there's tables outside and there's tables inside, and the wait staff in Israel asks you, do you want to sit bachutz, which means outside, or bifnim, which means inside? It's all connected. Um, okay, so there's a connection between Sarah and this verse. But here's the other one I want to tell you. This is Bruria, which is one of the very few women who are mentioned by name in the Talmud. And she was the wife of Rabbi Meir, and she is very well known for having been a Torah scholar. There's a whole lot more to say about her, but here's the connection. Okay, there's a very famous story about her that relates to she had two sons that died on the same day. They died suddenly on a Shabbat afternoon, and she withheld the news from her husband so as not to disturb his the calmness of his Shabbat. And um, the rabbis consider that a very elevated action on her part. And then after Havdalah, which is a ceremony marking the end of Shabbat, she says to her husband, some time ago, I was entrusted by a friend with some jewels for safekeeping, and now he wants them back. Shall I return them? So it sounds like jewels, pearls, you get the connection. So it sounds like she's asking a question of Jewish law of her husband, who was one of the great Torah scholars of his day. And he answers her, as you might imagine, of course, the jewels must be returned. And then Bruria takes Rebbe Meir to where their dead sons lie. She had laid them out on a bed and covered them. And when Rebbe Meir collapsed in grief, she gently reminded him, did you not say that we must return to the owner the precious jewels that he entrusted us? The Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so, in this way, she broke the news to her husband without violating Shabbat, and that means that she held it. If you think about it, from the time that she understood that her sons had died suddenly, she held that in herself, not to disrupt her husband's Shabbat. This is also, by the way, this verse, and most of them don't have three, but this one does. Later at the end, we'll see one biblical character that has three verses associated with her, but this one verse has three people. And the third one, so we talked about Sarah, we talked about Bruria, and now we're talking about Naama. Naama was anybody know who Naama was? If you know, just unmute yourself and say. I'm waiting for you, Natalie, because I feel like you're reaching for your screen because you want to unmute yourself. Do you know?
The wife of David? One of the wife of David?
Not this one. She was the wife of Noah, the wife of Noah.
Uh,
And her deeds are equated with the deeds of Noah, that she was worthy to be saved from the waters of the flood on her own merit, not just because she was riding on his coattails. She was the one who had influence, according to the rabbis, of whatever greatness Noah had. She was the one, and she was also able to remember that they also lived in a wicked generation. And she was also able to, like we said about Sarah, withstand um, the influence of the wickedness around her and stay pure. Okay, that's the first verse. Let's go on. You see how this is going to work, okay? Chapter 31, verse 11. Her husband's heart relies on her, and he shall lack no fortune. There's another opinion that this verse also is relates to Sarah, by whose merit Abraham became wealthy. Um, if you look at Bereshit in the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 13, Abraham says to her, please say that you are my sister, that it may go well for me for your sake. So this is the incident where they have entered Egypt, and Avram, he's Avram at that time. He presents himself as her brother, and says that he wants to tell everybody that she wants to get married. And his plan was that as her brother, her closest male relative, anybody who wanted to marry her would have to come to him for a marriage proposal. And his plan to protect her was to demand a prohibitively large sum of like a dowry for the privilege of marrying her. And no one would be able to offer or afford that kind of money. And his plan was foiled because as soon as she entered into Egypt, what happened to her? The soldiers of Paro said, this is a very beautiful, exceptional woman. She belongs with Paro. And so obviously he had the means to pay any bride price. all goes well in the sense that Sarah is not violated. And what happens at the end of the story? Avram leaves Egypt with great wealth, with sheep, with cattle, with men servants, with maidservants. Now, how, you may ask, do we reconcile the idea that Sarah's in this predicament and Avram is the one that's accepting payment, right? She's the one who suffered by being taken into the palace of Paro, of Pharaoh, and her husband is rewarded. So there's an opinion that Avram's reward was for his faith in the goodness and the holiness of Sarah, that he knew that she was so great that Hashem would protect her, would do a miracle for her, and that she would, in fact, be safe in Pharaoh's house and would not be violated. And in fact, way back when, I don't remember when we learned this story, we learned that in fact she had an angel at her command, and she was able to keep Paro at a distance by telling the angel stay to hurt Pyre whenever he came close to her. Okay. So the reward, according to the Abarbanel, that's one opinion, is that Hashem rewarded Abraham for his faith in Sarah's greatness and that greatness would protect her. So if we look back at the verse, her husband's heart relies on her and he shall lack no fortune. We can see the connection, right? You with me? You see it? Okay. Um, verse 12, she repays his good, but never his harm all the days of her life. This is a reference to our foremother Rivka, who was very kind to her husband Yitzchak, to Isaac, when his mother passed away. Through Rivka, Yitzchak, Isaac, was comforted for the death of his mother. His mother was Sarah, of course. And there were three blessings that God gave to Sarah that disappeared from the world when she died, that were only restored when Rivka came into the tent of Yitzchak. And they were the candles that burned from Erev Shabbos to Erev Shabbos. They like never went out, which is obviously a miracle because whatever you burn, it doesn't last for so long. The challah dough, her challah dough remained fresh from and plentiful from Erev Shabbos to Erev Shabbos. And the Ananei HaKavod, the cloud of glory, which we understand to be a representation of the Shekhinah, of the feminine presence in the world, rested in a cloud above her tent. Okay. So those three signs, which disappeared when Sarah died, reappeared when Yitzhak took Rivka as a wife. Okay, so she was good to her husband because she reinstated these special family gifts. The one opinion is that the fact that she agreed to marry him at all. Remember that marriage, they didn't know each other. She was living in another country when Eliezer came to get her, and she agreed to marry Yitzchak sight unseen, and that was a great goodness that she did for him. Also, Yitzchak Isaac is portrayed in Torah and in commentary as a fairly passive character, taking a backseat role in this marriage, and Rivka is the active one in this relationship. She agrees to marry him. She gets down from her camel as soon as she sees him praying in the field. When she's pregnant, she goes to find an answer from Shem and Aver. She does what she needs to do, and of course, she orchestrates um, the transfer of the blessing from Esau to Jacob to Isaac to Yaakov. She orchestrates that too, and so she's the kind of person who does what needs to be done when it's time to do that. And so she's a perfect complement to Yitzchak, to Isaac. She is strong in the qualities where he is not strong. She's also was a perfect match for him because both of them possessed this great inner strength. His expressed itself in a more um, internal way. So here I'll stop and say something about the way that the Torah sees the difference between men and women's worship of God in a Jewish context. If you know anything about Jewish prayer, or if you ask anybody anything about Jewish prayer, they will probably imagine, or synagogue prayer, they will probably imagine men, right? A lot of the public worship roles are on men, which does not mean and is not meant to conclude that women have no relationship with God, but that the relationship that women in a Torah environment have with God is usually more private. So in this way, their roles are reversed. Yitzchak, in a way, is more feminine. I'm not doubting his sexuality. I'm just saying, like, his way of connecting to God is more private, and her is action is more public. He was Think of the Akedah, think of the binding of Isaac, where he agrees and goes along with everything. He's 37 years old. He's not a child, but he goes along with, excuse me, he goes along with what he sees as God's will. Her inner strength is displayed when she takes an active role. But in any case, the idea here that relates is that she repays his good but never his harm all the days of his life. Is that Rivka was the perfect complement to Yitzhak. Chapter 31, verse 13. She seeks out wool and linen, and her hands work willingly. This is actually considered a reference to Leah, who received Jacob with a smile. It says in I'm sorry that here I did not write down the verse. Um, it says in Bereshit, in Genesis, that Yaakov came from the field in the evening, and Leah came to greet him, and she said to him, "You will come with me because I purchased you with my dudaim." And she lay with him that night, and it is for this reason she merited a seat coming from her kings and prophets and heads of tribes. Okay, so this is a sort of a uh I don't know if it's mystical, but there's something going on here a little bit under the surface. What are dudaim? Dudaim are understood to be a kind of flower, probably a kind of violet that was used in biblical times to enhance fertility. In the verse, it says she seeks out wool and linen, and her hands work willingly. In this incident that I just told you about, she expresses great willingness to have her husband be with her that night in her tent and to thereby build up the tribes. This verse describes a woman who takes initiative, and Leah's initiative is demonstrated in another way, and that is in the way that she changes this whole decree on her life. So, what is the story there? When they were born, Lavan and Rivka, who are siblings, each have twins. Lavan has Rachel and Leah, right? Rachel and Leah. And Rivka has Esav and Yaakov, Esau and Jacob. Do I need to keep translating these names? Are you with me? Okay. And so the two siblings make an agreement that the older twin would marry the older male twin would marry the older female twin, and the younger male twin would marry the younger female twin, which would have made Leah, who was older, connected to Esav and married to Esav if it had played out. But Leah found out how wicked Esav was, and according to the Gemaras, she wept so much that her eyelashes fell out. Um, and her weeping was so powerful that God canceled this plan that the siblings made for her to marry Esav, and she merited to marry Yaakov. Not only did she marry Yaakov instead of Esav, but she married Yaakov before Rachel did, who was his original intended spouse. Okay. There's another part of this verse. Um, she seeks out wool and linen. I think we spoke last week about the biblical commandment about shatnez, about wool and linen in the same garment. So wool and linen can't be together in the same garment according to Torah law, because together they make this prohibition called shatnez. But look at what happened. Leah worked hard to make sure she's not together with Asa because she knows they don't belong together, just like wool and linen don't belong together. There's just parenthetically also a connection with Sarah, who also saw two things that don't belong together, like wool and linen, like Leah and Esav, and that was Yishmael and Yitzhak, the two half brothers, because she realized that that combination was only going to cause harm. Okay. Let's go on. Verse 14. She is like a merchant ship from afar. She brings her sustenance. This is a reference to Rachel. Rachel, Rachel, it's all the same person, who lived a life of great embarrassment, first because um, her sister married her intended before she did, and also because her sister kept having child after child after child, and she was still barren. Okay. So she is merited to have someone come from her, one of her descendants, who's compared to a boat and is only filled with good. And that person, of course, is Yosef, whose great merit was that he fed the whole world in a time of starvation. So here's a couple of connections. In her barren years, children for Rachel were like ships seen from afar, that they remained a distant vision for her. Her ship came in when Yosef was born, and that ultimately, as he grew and his whole story played out, he became in a position to feed many nations during this great famine. And so it says, from afar she brings her sustenance. You see, there's a connection here. Um, Also, Rachel is one who embodies someone who has unfulfilled dreams. So we already talked about her original dream to marry Yaakov when she was, I guess, betrothed to him at a young age, and also her dream to have children. It took her 7 years to get married. She waits many more years to be a mother, and then she dies giving birth to her second son. And then, if you look in the book of Yirmiyahu, in Jeremiah, chapter 31, verse 14, it talks about Rachel weeping for her children. What is that a reference to? It is a reference to the return of the exiles. And I'm pretty sure I told you about this, that today, when a new family makes Aliyah, they come to Israel for the first time, that they are in synagogue on Friday night, that the custom is to sing these verses from the book of Jeremiah that talk about her children will return to her borders. And it is a very beautiful thing. And it is a reference to this, um, this dream of Rachel, who is really still waiting for all of her children to come home. Okay. Verse 15, she arises while it is yet nighttime and gives food to her household and a ration to her maidens. This is a reference to Batya. Batya is the daughter of Paro, who was a non-Jew, who eventually ended up joining, well, she joined the Israelite nation, and her name is mentioned among, when I do the next book, Batya will get a whole chapter because her name is mentioned among the elevated souls of the nation of Israel, and she merited to be one of the 10 people who entered Gan Eden, who entered the Garden of Eden while still living. According to the rabbis, she had a prophecy that she would be the one to save the redeemer of the Hebrew slaves. So she used to get up at night and look for him. So when it says she arises when it is yet nighttime, there's a connection there. It wasn't by accident that she found him in the Nile River. She went out to find him, and she needed him to fulfill her vitally important role of raising the Redeemer. There's another opinion. She arises while it is yet nighttime, that there was, you're familiar with the plague, the plague of the death of the firstborn. Batya was a firstborn, but she survived that plague of death because God had a different plan for her. Okay, so she got up after the night of the 10th plague. That's another allusion to arising. Um, this part of the story, I think I'll um, just review that she was standing at the bank of the Nile. Some say that she was preparing to immerse in the Nile in order to rid herself of any contamination of idol worship that had been part of her society. When baby Moses floated by. This is a little funny because today for lunch I made something. I usually only make it for Shabbat, and I we had it for Shabbat. And my 4-year-old granddaughter loved it, and I thought, oh, I why don't I make this during the week? So you know what pigs in a blanket are? Like hot dogs wrapped in some kind of dough. So, we don't call it that here. We call it Moshe B'Teva, which means Moses in the Ark. It's the same thing. But anyway, it just so happens that I had that for lunch today. It was very good. Okay. So Batya stretches out her hand to reach for baby Moses, just like a woman of valor, the Aishet Chayil stretches herself and what she has to provide for the needs of her household. And as she stood by the Nile River waiting for him, just like the woman of valor stands before her household ahead of everyone else, she saves his life, guards him spiritually as he grows up in the palace of Paro, just like the woman of valor guards the spiritual needs of the people in her household. Um, and she tends to their individual spiritual needs the same way that Batya took care of Moses. Okay. Verse 16, she envisions a field and buys it. From the fruit of her handiwork, she plants a vineyard. This, according to this midrash, is a reference to Yocheved. Yocheved is the mother of Moshe. It's interesting that as these things play out, they play out kind of in chronological or in biblical order, right? We start with Sarah and Rivka and Rachel and Leah, and now we're in the Moses chapter, so we're now like kind of in the book of Shemot. Um, okay, so the rabbis say that Moses was on one side of the scale, and all of Israel is on the other side of the scale. Israel is referred to as a kerem, which is a vineyard. And if you look in the book of Isaiah, in Yeshayahu, chapter 5, verse 7, it talks about how the house of Israel is God's vineyard. Yocheved gave birth to Moshe, which is equal in value to all of Israel, because all of Israel is called a kerem, a vineyard. Okay, so Moshe equals all of Israel equals a vineyard. There's the vineyard connection to this verse. Also, Yocheved planted the vineyard of the Israelite nation that would eventually become the Jewish people through her midwifery, right? As a midwife, she made sure that the children of the Hebrew slaves were not killed the way that Paro's edict required of her. And she worked in defiance of that edict, not only to not kill them, but to make them grow and thrive. Actually, midwifery can be compared to a vineyard because just like a vineyard produces grapes from which wine is made, and wine can be raised to the highest level of holiness, like we use wine at the Shabbat table, we use wine um, at Brit Milah, at a ritual circumcision. We use wine in our under a chuppah at a wedding. We use wine at our highest, holiest moments. Wine can also, too much wine, can also make people engage in behaviors that are degrading. Okay, the lowest forms of human. We talked about this concept before of everything that has a potential for holiness has a potential for an equal and opposite mirror image potential for degradation. So similarly, the Jewish people today, who Yocheved helped to grow in the vineyard of her midwifery, have the potential to either rise in holiness or fall in degradation. And that's one of the reasons why, not to air our dirty laundry, but when a crime is committed by a Jew, it seems to get a lot more attention than in the news and so forth than a crime that, like, people make a point of mentioning, especially if it was a white collar crime, but whatever, that it was that this crime was committed by a Jew. Um, okay, and just to wrap this one up, just like a farmer makes every effort, or a vintner, whatever, to protect their crops during a storm, Yocheved fought for her people against the wishes of Pharaoh. Um, okay, chapter 31, verse 17, with strength she girds her loins and invigorates her arms. This relates to, you might not be surprised to hear if you're following along the chronology, Miriam. Okay. Um, Before Moses is born, Miriam has a prophecy that in the future, my mother will give birth to the one who will redeem Israel. And at the time that he was born, there was the decree to toss the baby boys into the Nile River. And so her father, whose name was Amram, stood and tapped her on the head and in a not a nice way and questioned her prophecy. And the more he did, the more she became stronger in believing that her prophecy will come true, even though it doesn't look very good right now. Okay. And so she is a model of Emuna because this baby is born. She has a prophecy. This baby's going to redeem her nation. And yet the decree right now is that this baby's not only not going to redeem the nation, he's not going to live for, another week. But when Amram challenged her prophecy, she became stronger and more sure about it. She worked hard along with Yocheved, because remember I told you that Shifra and Pua, we see this in the first chapter of Shemot in the book of Exodus, that Shifra and Pua are generally understood to be Yocheved and her daughter Miriam, that to deliver these babies against Paro's decree. And also, what is more evidence of her strength? That she prepared for miracles much later in the story. She prepared for miracles when she packed tambourines and encouraged the women to pack tambourines to use after crossing the Red Sea, after the sea split. Okay, that's the strength of Miriam. Verse 18, she discerns that her enterprise is good, so her lamp is not snuffed out at night. Okay, now we are going to leave the 5 books of Moses and we are going, right, for this purpose, we're going into the book of Tehillim, in the book of Psalms, chapter 99, verse 6, which says, wait, I'm jumping ahead of myself. This is a reference to Hannah, whose story we find in the book of Samuel, in the book of Shmuel. Um, the rabbis say she tasted the taste of prayer, and she merited to see coming from her someone who was a perfect, I don't know, it's not replacement for, but inheritor of the special contributions of Moses and Aaron, Moshe and Aaron. Okay, and here's where it says in Tehillim chapter 99, verse 6, it says, Moshe and Aaron were among his priests, and Shmuel, Samuel, was among those who invoke his name. So they are joined in this verse. The assumption or the way to understand it is like we were talking before about how Moshe was like equal to all of Israel, which is equal to the vineyard. So Shmuel, Samuel, is equal to Moshe and Aaron. So you know the basic story. I'm assuming for many years Hannah was barren. She went to the Mishkan, to the site of the tabernacle, and she's praying for a son. And in her prayer, which is what the rabbis use as a model for the way prayer should be conducted today, she tasted the taste of prayer. What does that mean? She prayed silently. The prayer was in her mouth. It wasn't vocalized. She moved her lips. If you've ever been in a prayer situation with Orthodox Jews, you will see that often they move their lips reciting words of prayer, but they're not vocalizing them. That is very, very common in Torah homes or in an Orthodox synagogue. And that we learned that way of praying from Hannah, who was the first one to do it. And if you go back and look at the story in the book of Samuel, you will see that people didn't understand what she was doing. And the high priest at the time, whose name was Eli, came to her and accused her of being drunk because her mouth was moving and no words were coming out. Now it's like a standard way of prayer, but at the time, um, it was not understood. And she introduced this new taste of prayer. And so when Eli realized that what she was doing was kosher, because first he accused her of being drunk and coming to the Mishkan drunk, which was not a nice thing. He said that her prayer, which was to have a son, had been granted, and and this goes back to the verse, she saw that her enterprise was good. Okay, what was her enterprise? Her enterprise was this special form of prayer. And her son Shmuel, I told you, was equated to Moshe and Aaron, who lit up all of Israel. This is a reference you see in the verse. It talks about a lamp, the light of a lamp. Um, in fact, Shmuel's teacher, who was the prophet Eli, is referred to as the lamp of God by the rabbis. Eli raised Shmuel as if he were his own child. So when Samuel was 3 or 4, I can't remember, but he was a very young child. After he was weaned, Hannah brought him back to the Mishkan and basically gave him to the service of God. And so this child that she had prayed for, she gave up the opportunity to raise in her own home, and he was raised by Eli the high priest as if he was his own child. And in fact, later in the story, there's not relevant to what we're talking about, but Eli does have like natural children, whatever, biological children who don't turn out that good. But Shmuel does. And Samuel, is the prophet who anoints King David much later in the story. And here's just another connection to light, that King David's light relates to Mashiach, to the Messiah, whose light is eternal. Okay, so there's a lot of themes of lamp, light, in this. Verse 19, her hands stretch out to the distaff and her palms support the spindle. The distaff, remember, it holds, not that I know that much about weaving, but it holds the fibers that are fed into the spindle um, to twist them to make them into thread. Okay. This is a reference to Yael, who whose story is told in the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges. Um, I think so. I should have looked this up. Anyway, um, she did not kill with a weapon of war, but she killed in a sort of a feminine way. Why did she not kill with a weapon of war? Because there's a verse in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, chapter 22, verse 5, that prohibits a man from wearing women's garments and a woman from wearing men's garments. And so a, a distaff, a kishore, that's the Hebrew word for it, this part of the loom, is a feminine tool. Yael killed Sisera with a feminine weapon. What was it? It was a tent peg, rather than through military means. Military means, military weapons, those are masculine. She used a domestic tool, a tool that's used to build a home, or in this case, a tent, um, in order to kill Sisera. So just as she brought out the hidden power, the hidden potential in a tent peg, which is a common physical object, spinning brings out the full value of raw thread. Raw thread by itself is not useful to us, but when you spin it and you make a garment or a blanket or something like that, then it becomes a useful garment. So the connection is that the woman of valor, the Aishet Chayil, uses the physical objects in her home to their fullest potential to serve God. And I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before, but in this context, I want to tell you again that the Star of David has two overlapping triangles. The first, for our purposes, the first triangle is broad on the top and pointed on the bottom. Okay. That represents the masculine spiritual role in the world, because what men do is they bring down through their prayer and Torah study, this is a traditional understanding, they bring down these elevated spiritual things, they bring them down to earth, right? You can picture an upside down triangle. What women do, according to this way of understanding, is they raise the physical to an elevated spiritual place. So what do I mean by that? Let's take, for example, the ingredients in that are used to make challah. All very simple ingredients, right? But when they are combined in the proper way with the proper intention, and you are creating, a woman is creating for her household, for her Shabbat, she's creating this special bread upon which blessings are made and so forth. She's elevating the sugar and the yeast and the flour and the egg, whatever, those simple, basic, fundamental physical ingredients, raising them to where they are become holy and spiritual. The same thing with a Shabbat candle. Shabbat candle, I mean, it can be a fancy like dinner taper or something, but really, when you light them every week, most Shabbat candles are very simple white wax, right? Either they are a tea light or a very simple white candle, and there's nothing elevated about them. They're pretty inexpensive. They're pretty simple. But when a woman, in this case, I'm going to say a Jewish woman, makes a blessing on them at the beginning of Shabbat, she has raised this very simple physical thing to a higher spiritual purpose. And I'll finish this little side note with this one other example, and that is, look what a woman does in her body with a fertilized egg, right? Which is a very simple, small, um, physical thing that we can't even see with the physical eye, and through her um, through her body, she creates a human being. I mean, obviously God's helping also. But she's taking some very simple physical cells and nurturing them in such a way that 9 months later there's an actual human being there. Okay, that is Yael bringing out the hidden power of the tent peg. Verse 20, she spreads out her palm to the poor and extends her hands to the destitute. This story you may be somewhat less familiar with. It's found in Malachim Bet, 2 Kings, chapter 17, verses 9 through 24. And the story is that there's a widow in a city called Tzarfat, and um, she gives Eliyahu in a time um, in here's the story. God sends Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu a Navi, to find a specific woman in Tzarfat who's going to sustain him. And he encounters a woman gathering firewood. And by the way, there's a famine going on at this time, which is why he needs help with food. And he asks her for water, and she very happily gives him some water. And then he asks for food, and she says that there is no food to spare. She has this little bit of flour and a little bit of oil that she's going to bake for herself and for her son, and it's their last bit of food. And Eliyahu assures her that if she will share this tiny portion of food that she has with him, this is chapter 17, verse 14, his promise to her is that the meager food, that the jug of flour will not run out and the flask of oil will not lack until the day that Hashem provides rain on the face of the earth, meaning until the famine ends. And so she rushes to do that. With She believes in his prophecy, and so she gives him basically her last bit of bread to this hungry stranger, and she's rewarded twice. Her immediate reward is that she and her household have sustenance during this famine through God's blessing until the ground starts producing food again in a natural way. And she invites Elijah, to stay with her, and she's able to feed him for a year until the famine is over. Um, there's another little piece of the story but she gives from her last bit of bread to a hungry stranger. That is the connection to she spreads out her palm to the poor and extends her hands to the destitute. There's another little part of the story that during the year that Eliyahu was spending in her home, her son becomes ill and he dies. And she goes to him and she asks why she's been so kind to share their limited provisions with him. And she's being repaid with the death of her son. And so this is one of the revival stories, resuscitation stories, that Eliyahu prays, and he is able to resuscitate this widow's son. Okay. Um, chapter 31, verse 21. She fears not snow for her household, for entire household is clothed with scarlet wool. This is a direct reference to something that we studied a few months ago, and it is a reference to Rachav, whose story is told in the book of Judges, in the book of Shoftim, that she was not afraid of the when the Israelites were going to come in because Joshua told her to tie a scarlet rope or a scarlet string as a sign to leave her household. We've talked about this in great detail. I'm not going to review it again. So I'm going to skip all this, but she's directed to tie this scarlet cord in the window, and the spies will know to protect her household, and they honor their promise. And so Rachav and her family are able to survive the onslaught, and she lives in the land of Israel for the rest of her life. Okay, I'm skipping all the Rachav story because we went through it together, and if you don't remember, I can send you the link to that class. Okay. Verse 22. I'm looking at the time. I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to finish this, but I'm not sure. Luxurious bedspread she made herself, linen and purple wool are her clothing. So it's the phrase linen and purple wool, which are a symbol of royalty. That this refers to Bathsheba. Bathsheba is one of the wives of King David, who is also the mother of Shlomo Melech of King Solomon, who wore robes of linen and I get purple linen and purple wool. So as queen to King David, and she was also after King David died, and her son King Solomon was the ruler. King Solomon gave her a place of prominence in his kingdom, and so she continued. She wasn't displaced as like the wife of the former king, whatever you call that. She had a place of honor in the court of Solomon, and she continued to wear fine linen and purple wool. And there's an incident where that also relates to this concept of royalty. Near the end of King David's life, the prophet of the time is Nathan. And he goes to Bathsheba to tell her that one of the sons of King David, not her son, a son that we call Adoniyahu, I have no idea what you guys call her. I don't know what the English is for that. They may know. Yeah, Valerie, what is it? Can you unmute yourself and tell me what is Adoniyahu called? I see your mouth moving, but you're still muted. There we
Sorry,
go.
I got say the name again because I think you're saying Adonijah.
Adoniyahu,
Adoniyahu.
son,
Uh,
he's the rebellious
Adonijah.
son of
Yeah,
King David.
I think you're you all agree with me? I think she's thinking Adonijah. Do you what
Adonai,
chapter?
that's probably it. That's probably it.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
so. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, this particular son, he's busy making while his father's dying, he's making this whole big banquet to position himself to be the next king without David's okay. And so Nathan, the prophet, encourages Bathsheba to go and speak to her husband and remind him that he promised to appoint her son Solomon as his natural successor. But her approach has to be very gentle, very careful, because David is old and he's dying. And she's telling him not such good news. She's telling him that one of his sons is usurping the position as king. And so she has to advocate for her son in a way that doesn't sound self serving, but that expresses her concern for the good of the nation and not her own selfish interests. So Bathsheba, as the queen to King David, wore these royal garments, this fine linen and purple wool. She was also able to speak to David, to King David, in this majestic manner to ensure that her son would ascend to the throne and that he would wear these royal colors himself. Okay, so that's the thread of that story. Verse 23, distinctive in the councils is her husband, and he sits with the elders of the land. This is a reference to Michal, who was the first wife of King David, who saved King David from death. And you'll find this story in Shmuel Aleph, 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 20 to 28, and also 19, verses 11 through 18. Michal is, just to remind you, the daughter of the reigning king, King Saul, and she loves David. And David is not yet, at this point in the story, he's not yet been anointed the next king. Her father, Saul, agrees to let her marry David as a political move because he wants to keep David close because he doesn't trust him. He's jealous of him. And so he plans to send him into battle with the Philistines, the Plishtim, who are this eternal enemy um, of the nation of Israel, and have him killed in battle. That's Shaul, Saul's plan. And there's also in this story that Saul chases David all over his kingdom. And at one point, David takes refuge in Michal's chambers, in her bedroom. And she encourages him to like skip out the back window, and she sets up truffim, which are household idols that are shaped like humans. As far as I know, they don't exist anymore, but they play a role in a couple of biblical stories. This is one of them. And she made it look like David was sleeping in bed. And so when her father and his soldiers came to take David into custody, she convinced him that he was sick and that he was bedridden. And meanwhile, David slipped out the back. And when Saul discovered the truth of the situation and asked why Michal was being disloyal to her father, she lied again, and she said that David threatened to kill her if she didn't help him escape. And so um, she was just defending her own life. That was her defense. So besides saving his life, Michal also made it possible for David to flee to the prophet Shmuel, where he studied Torah. So Michal saved his life, but she also enabled him to learn Torah, and in that way she contributed to his eventual success as a king. And this is, if you look back at the verse, distinctive in the councils is her husband as he sits with the elders of the land. She made it possible for him to kind of grow into kingship. Um, chapter 31, verse 24, she makes cloaks to sell and delivers a belt to the peddler. This is in the book of Judges. So I see now that in this part of it, it's not chronological anymore, but we are in the books of prophets. The book of Judges, Shoftim, chapter 13, verses 2 through 24. This is the story of Samson. And this verse is a reference to Samson's mother, who is not named in Tanakh, but she is named in the Gemara, and her name is Tzelelponit. She is the mother of Samson. Okay, so here's the basic story. An angel visits Tzelelponit to announce that she's going to have a son who's going to be consecrated as a Nazir, which means that it's a special category. He can't cut his hair. This should sound familiar because we're talking about Samson here. He can't have grapes. And I think there's a third condition. I don't remember what it is. But he's going to grow up and he's going to save Israel from the enemy Plishtim. And Seloponi tells her husband about this visit that she got from this angel. And her husband, who is named, by the way, in Shoftim, his name is Manoach, he asks to see the angel himself. And so the angel comes again to her, and she says, "Hang on just a second, I'm going to go get my husband." And she brings him to the place where he came. And in fact, as the prophecy is fulfilled, she gives birth to a son who she names Samson, Shimshon, and he does grow up to be this Nazir, strong and brave. So there's an opinion that what's the connection to this? Later in his life, Samson promises 30 cloaks to the Philistines if they could solve a riddle that he makes up. You will find this in the book of Judges, Shoftim, chapter 14, verses 12 through 19. And even though they cheated to come up with the answer, he still had to pay. So when Tzeloponit, Shimshon's mother, heard about this, she rushed to make the cloaks. Okay, she makes cloaks to sell. But by the time she was able to connect with her son, he told her, "Don't bother because he's already paid them off with the cloaks of 30 Plishtim that he killed." But she had already made them, so she sold them. She sold the cloaks that she had made. She makes cloaks to sell. Okay, direct connection. Verse 25, strength and majesty are her raiment. She joyfully awaits her last day. This is a reference, and this is the last one we're going to have time to do today because it's 5 of. This is a reference to Elisheva, and I believe that we spoke about Elisheva not too long ago because in the Parsha of Shmini, where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is inaugurated, this is in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, chapter 9, chapter 10. Elisheva is the wife of Aaron HaKohen. And on the day that the Mishkan is consecrated in the desert, I told you this before, but I'll say it again. Her husband became the high priest. Her brother Nachshon was a prince of Israel. He made the first offering in the tabernacle, and her two eldest sons, Eleazar and Itamar, were appointed as young priests. Immediately after that, two of her sons, Nadav and Avihu, were overzealous in their service in the Mishkan, and they brought an unauthorized offering, what the Torah calls a strange fire, and they were wholly consumed. And so there's a very famous commentary on this parsha that says that Aaron was silent. Okay, he did not speak. But what about Elisheva? So Elisheva is also, by the rabbis, not so much in the text, credited with this quality of absolute faith in the correctness of God's punishment. And she doesn't fall into the pit of despair, even though her family has just experienced tragedy. And it's even worse because it was this day of tremendous triumph. And by the time the day is over, it is it has turned to tragedy. It reminds me a little bit of the tragedy we spoke about last week, or maybe only on WhatsApp, about the woman Se'ela Gez, who was pregnant and in labor, about to give birth to her fourth child. A moment of great excitement and so forth, and before the day is over, she's dead. By the way, just before class started, I got a text that they named the child, who's still in pretty serious condition, and I will send that name to you so that you can maybe add your prayers for his well-being. In any case, this quality of profound understanding and emuna and clear faith in the face of both triumph and tragedy allows Elisheva to, quote, joyfully await the last day. So what's the lesson to us? The lesson to us is hard things happen to us, painful things happen to us, and we don't always understand them. But that emuna is the tool that we have that Elisheva expresses on this day of the inauguration of the Mishkan. But it's also a message to us that emuna reminds us that it all works out in the end. So there's an expression. It isn't a Torah expression. I don't know where it comes from, but um, it's something like um, it every if it if it isn't good, it isn't the end, or something like that. Um, and so that's not to say that there aren't situations that we live through that are very challenging, that pain us very much and so forth. But there is a concept of the that emuna, like Elisheva illustrated, gives us the opportunity to look forward to a good ending, and that, of course, is all wrapped up in the whole concept of Geula and the Messianic era and all that. But even short term, like we are all old enough to know that we have lived through circumstances that, as they were happening to us, were very painful. And later on, we came to see how that was actually a door that Hashem was opening to something much better that we did not understand at the time. So that's a good note to leave on. We have a few more verses which I want to save, and also next week we'll finish this Aishet Chayil piece with the symbolism that we find in the verses of non-women things things in tradition um, that are other than women. Because now we've talked about sort of the ideal woman from this biblical perspective, and also specific women. I hope that you can see, sometimes it's a little bit more of a stretch than others, but basically how you can see that each of these verses has a connection to the story of a woman in Tanakh, except for Beruria, who's in the Talmud. Okay, that's what I came to share with you tonight. We have zero time left. um, I'm happy to stay here if anybody has a comment or a question that you want to ask. Otherwise, we will bid each other goodbye, and and the picture that I showed you won't make sense because I haven't told you that story yet, but it'll make sense next week. Elizabeth, okay. Did you want to say
Yeah.
anything? Anybody want to say anything?
Yes, I had a question. You said
Yes,
that it is against Torah law to wear linen and wool together,
right.
but you said Bathsheba wore um, linen and purple wool.
You are absolutely correct. So the prohibition is not to wear them, like to have them in your wardrobe, but to wear them in the same garment.
Just go.
Okay,
But, but,
layers.
Just put your nana.
but you raise an interesting question, and I would like to look into that more. That is, wow, you were really paying attention. I believe that the way we understand that is like, let's say she was wearing a linen dress and then a purple wool cloak or something like that, not in the same garment. That's the way that I understand it. But if it
And
can't
I
be,
also,
it can't be that the wife of King David violated
uh,
this mitzvah. So
and I'd also heard, and I don't know if this is true, is that the reason it's prohibited is because only ones who can do that are the high priest could wear the garment with mixed. You know,
well,
is that
like anything
I'm so
in
sorry. I've got to
Torah.
go. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, you
I
what?
have to go.
Oh no,
Sorry.
fine, fine, that's fine.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you guys. There's actually multiple levels of answers for it, but the truth is that it falls into the category of mitzvot called chukim, which are the 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 things that God asks of us that we don't fully understand. I mean, we won't fully understand until the Messiah comes and explains the Torah, that the parts of the Torah that we don't have. I have heard various explanations on increasingly deep levels. So I have not heard that a high priest could wear shatnez, could wear this combination of wool and linen, but I'm not an expert on this, and so that's another thing I would like to look up and get back to you on. Val, you
I
want to say
think
something?
I think she probably means their garments. The priestly garments were interwoven with wool and linen when they were in the temple. But they could, you remember, they couldn't wear those garments outside of the temple. In fact, even in Ezekiel, when it's talking about the one that's coming, there's a specific warning there to tell the priest to make sure they don't wear their robes outside among the people because they would basically it would kill people if they did that because they had been in the temple and probably how they're made and how they had been used and so forth. And so but as I understand it, the priestly garments, not just the high priest, but I think other things that they wore actually had both of those things in them.
You could be right. I have to look it up because I don't know.
and maybe even the tzitzit. I think there was.
Of the
I
high
think.
priest or
Oh no, even the tzitzit. There is some linen and some wool. I don't know, but it's what I heard. It's something will be interesting to know. One thing that I've learned also is like about frequency. They
right.
have the same frequency, linen and weight, wool, but one is going one direction and the other one is, I don't know exactly how to explain, and the other
I've
one
heard
is,
that, yeah.
which means that it makes zero, it just nullify, which means like they have no protection. They don't, and fragrances are very important. Is one of the things maybe in the temple is like if they were having if they were having linen and linen and wool, because they were in the temple, the fragrancy was very different and it was okay. But I don't know, this is like a bit of speculation, but it will be very interesting because fragrance is something that we start to hear
Right.
about.
I have also heard that, as I don't fully understand it. Again, it isn't, practically speaking, it seems to be more of an issue with people who wear like wool suits, um, which I don't
Mm.
do. That they have to get them checked for linen threads. Um, so it isn't, or it isn't something that I know enough about clearly to answer these questions, but Valerie knows way more.
Well,
Carrie, you want, oh, go ahead.
I was
Yeah,
just
I
going to
just
say to her, the seat again, the threads, the individual threads, one of them can be wool and one of them can be linen. What they can't be done is woven together. So that's why in a seat you could actually have both of those two things. And why in a royal garment, if you had a shawl or a belt or a something else, why they could be together is how I understood it. or your top and your bottom are not the same materials. You know, you have a top and then you have a skirt or something
Right. So
like that.
besides conjecture, let me look into it instead of conjecturing because I would like to get an accurate answer. Carrie, we'll end with you. What's your question?
I just looking at the frequency of linen being discussed in the whole chapter that we're studying, I'm just curious what the Torah principle is of what does that signify? Because it seems like so many of these women are robed in linen or they're working with linen. There's wool mentioned, but it seems like linen seems to be what's the most thing referred to.
So again, I don't know enough about this to
Yeah,
answer,
right.
but I'm going to,
Sure.
I will have an answer
Okay.
for you before next week.
Thank you, Rivka.
Sure.
Or
Okay,
else we're
guys,
all going to show up in linen robes next week and we don't know why.
that would be elegant. Okay. All right, have a good week, you
Thanks.
guys. Bye.
Okay, bye.